You didn't see any evidence in the intelligence of espionage or in support of espionage. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You didn't see any evidence in the intelligence of sabotage or anything in support of sabotage.
That's correct.
You didn't see anything in the evidence, any evidence in the intelligence of any form of foreign influenced activities within or relating to Canada that involved the threat to any person.
I saw media accounts, yes. I saw no information collected or intelligence produced in that regard, no. To support that, no.
You didn't see any evidence in the intelligence of activities within or relating to Canada directed toward or in support of the threat of a use of acts of serious violence against persons for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada or a foreign state.
I saw online rhetoric. I saw information on social media. I saw assertions of that type of activity. Information. I'm aware of no intelligence that was produced that would support concern in that regard.
Thank you.
What were the sources of this early knowledge of the convoy?
So we had multiple investigative techniques that we were employing. So I could run through them. One was open source collection. And I want to stress that's information. Open source, so I put a lesser value on that at the origin point. Also, we had covert operations ongoing, which you won't see as related in the documentation before you because of the sensitivities. We engaged in a large degree of analysis and at times surveillance operations, and that's primary and source recruitment for covert operations. That information, all of which is information, is collected, and then we go through the collation and analysis process, and then we provide our analysis, which I refer to as intelligence, and that is how we came to the conclusions and assessments that we did.
When you say you found no credible intelligence of threats, were you involved in the investigations into particular threats that were made to various politicians and other public figures in Ottawa, or is that something that the OPS dealt with?
Primarily, that would be activity that the OPS engaged in.
Okay.
And also, I'm talking about, threats generally that would be premised in intelligence. Like, I'll give you an example. On February 2nd at 18:30 hours, we're going to breach security to the West Wing of Parliament, et cetera. And I have been engaged in protests before where things like that have happened, and we could find no credible intelligence of threats.
Those kinds of threats. So you're not talking about a threat that may be made against a particular individual, for example.
But that's true, but we never had intelligence of that, threats of those. And I mean, I've reviewed the arrests and the charges and stuff to try and ascertain how accurate we were. And there was, I would say, the lack of violent crime was shocking.
In your evidence, you made use of a term you referred to as microaggression. Is that right?
I believe so, multiple times.
Okay. Is microaggression, is your understanding of that it means verbal and environmental slights?
Je suis francophone, donc si vous voulez être spécifique sur les mots, va falloir...
I'm francophone, so if you want to ask me specific things about words, you're going to have to ask me in French. You're asking me a theory about how to define something. Unfortunately, my knowledge of English terminology is perhaps not sufficiently appropriate, Commissioner.
Je m'appelle Brendan.
My name is Brendan.
I think, it is funny, but it's not. I am doing my very best to answer clear questions in English. You asked me a very specific question on a definition. I'm saying, ask me, clarify in French. I'm glad to specify if it is yes or no. The specificity of the nuance of a word, I'm uncomfortable in responding to your question.
What of the words that I put to you, and there's a few, so means, verbal, and environmental, and slights is confusing? Is there, which one are you confused about?
J'ai expliqué plusieurs fois.
I've already tried to express this, and I've explained this to the Commissioner, that, to my mind, everything in the periphery of the red zone was what I would describe as being microaggressions. I could describe microaggressions to you. For example, go in front of somebody and pull their mask off. I don't know how we want to describe that as a definition, but that's an example of a microaggression. Walking into a restaurant, being asked to leave, and sitting down without having the right to stay. That's another microaggression. Fighting somebody who's homeless, beating somebody who's homeless. That's another microaggression, another type of aggression. Making so much noise at such high volumes that you have to close down a daycare. That's another kind of aggression. That's how I've described aggressions, Commissioner. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a background in specifics, but I'm trying to use the terminology that I can to be as specific as possible to describe what I received as information and what I was able to see.
So you had said that beating up a homeless person was an aggression, at least the translation. That's what it was. That's more of an assault. So had you witnessed any homeless people get beaten up by protesters?
No, if you recall my intervention, the Shepherds of Good Hope is located at the corner of King Edward and Murray. There was an incident with a client. The executive director reached out to me to inform me of the incident.
Okay. And were any charges laid?
I have no clue.
Okay. Who was the individual who was beaten? Do you know?
I have no clue.
Okay. Thanks.
It's a private property, so they could request that bylaw come and remove illegal vehicles. It was a truck, a construction type truck that had a legal diesel container in it. So the fear of it, as Councillor Fleury indicated last week, we should have evacuated the Rideau Centre. Well, that's not accurate because the risk was still very low. So in this particular case, the police attended initially, looked at the truck, spoke to the owner, told him he'd have to move it or he'd be getting a ticket. Bylaw eventually went out and gave them a ticket. Rideau Centre wanted it removed. It was one of those times when getting a tow for a small vehicle was more difficult, more challenging for us. And as a result of that, it took some time for us to secure the tow vehicle to come and actually remove it from the Rideau Centre. And when when the tow truck was finally en route, the owner moved it himself. So the Rideau Centre was frustrated that it took a day and a half to actually deal with this issue. But again, when we're dealing with the whole protest, we're looking at risk and we're looking at risk-based responses as
Your
well.
evidence in chief, you kept using the word violence regarding protesters, right?
Yes.
All right. And you've heard the evidence of Superintendent Morris already. You sort of touched on that. And he had stated that the lack of violence in Ottawa during the protest was actually shocking.
I don't recall that statement.
All right. So is it fair to say that when you use the phrase violence, you're not actually describing any form of physical assaults, are you?
It's the honking of large air horns
Right.
of approximately 300 to 400 to 500 trucks simultaneously for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Not the criminal code definition of violence, but the violence that they felt by having an incessant horns blared.
Right.
And by having trucks run 24/7 a day.
Right.
By having people intimidate them and follow them. And by having people rip masks off their head. By feeling sheltered in their homes.
So there's a total of 5 violent offenses charged between January 28th, 2022 and February 13th, 2022. Can you agree with me that in the entire same time period, there was no charges under the criminal code for causing a disturbance by fight or shouting or swearing?
That's yes.
And there was no charges laid against any of the protesters in that same time period for causing a disturbance by impeding or molesting a person?
That's correct.
All right. And there were also no charges laid with disturbing an occupant of a dwelling apartment or complex under the criminal code either, was there?
That's correct.
Okay. Can we scroll down? Perfect. And can you agree with me in that time period, that is from January 29th to February 13th at 11:59 p.m., there was no charges of inciting hatred in a public place ever laid, was there?
Correct.
And you can agree with me that in the same time period that only one charge of intimidation by threat of violence was ever laid?
Correct.
And in that same time period, there was never any charges of uttering threats to property to damage property under 264.1 of the criminal code either, right?
Correct.
All right. So you'd agree with me that that's not unprecedented violence, is it?
So as I defined violence, it wasn't strictly criminal code violence. And I'm happy to again go through the definition that I was using when I was talking about community violence. It was the trauma that the community felt. It was the extreme circumstances that they were exposed to and the duration of time that they were exposed to that has very clearly been described to me by community members as violence.
Can you agree with me that between January 27th and February 14th, there were over 3,000 tickets issued for provincial and municipal infractions?
That sounds correct. I'd have to actually look at that.
Were some of those tickets issued by the bylaw office?
Most of them were issued by the bylaw office.
3,000 tickets is a lot. That's a lot of interactions with a lot of protesters. And not a single assaulting a peace officer charge was laid in relation to your bylaw officers.
That's correct.
You're going to hear evidence eventually from some of the protesters when they eventually testify that some of the ones that were arrested upon their release, they were essentially kidnapped by OPS officers, driven out of town in the middle of February winter by OPS officers, and left in various rural areas and parking lots outside of town with no shelter or resources. Are you aware of that?
No, because I don't know the specifics of what they're speaking about. What I do know is that we, as part of our planning, and Inspector Lucas tomorrow will be able to provide more details, but we did have remote arrest processing sites, not in rural Ottawa.
So one of the areas, there was several, as I understand. One of them was a municipal parking lot where the trucks were being towed to.
That's correct. That's in the south end.
Right. And that parking lot doesn't have a building you drop them off at. It doesn't have a phone. It doesn't have any of that, does it?
So I don't know what the logistics at the building were. I would imagine it would have needed to have a phone because you have to be able to call your lawyer. So
I can tell you it didn't. So, and these people driven out there, they were already told they weren't charged, and they weren't being charged, they were being released. But they were driven and forced outside of Ottawa or in the outer skirts and dropped off in the snow. Now, are you aware this happened? Yes or no?
No, I'm not aware. And it wasn't outside of Ottawa. It was still within the geographical boundaries of the city of Ottawa.
The first concept, I think, is intuitive to the observer. That is, stop the money from going to the people who are committing the activity. But did you appreciate that you were moving to a different level? I mean, in the first, when you go to the deterrent mode, because you're starting to affect more than the protester, and you know that, right? In the first scenario, you're saying to the protester, we are going to cut off the money you're using to buy gas for your truck or whatever. And in the second mode, you're saying, we are going to cut off your family's money that they use to buy grocery and pay their rent, so you'd better get out of this protest, right? You're nodding.
Well, I'm nodding. I mean, I'm just understand what you're saying. So the question
And
is.
the question is, did you appreciate the significance? Are there other examples where the Department of Finance has used its authority, or the government has used the authority on the instruction or advice of the Department of Finance to have that type of effect, where you're not just trying to stop illegal activity by cutting off the funds that flow to it, but you're trying to deter the illegal activity by getting at the family and the other people who need that money?
To page 2 of this report and to the second last bullet, and I just asked you about fundraising. It indicates that at this point, on the 25th, the GoFundMe is at 4.4 million, which is an increase of almost $1 million in the last 24 hours. Was this something that POIB was keeping an eye on and concerned about?
We were definitely keeping an eye on it, and here's why. For any type of event of this nature, no matter what the motivation is, social media has altered the way we collect information and the meaning that we derive from it. We can always significantly discount some of the numbers that like it or say they'll be there. What we noticed in this event, and in some other previous events related to these grievances, was that there was much more meaning in the support. And the reason that the finances are so important is money is a powerful motivator, and this was growing rapidly. And I can say it was growing at a rate that for us was unprecedented. And so that added impact to our assessment that this would be significant.
And if you can just help me understand, was it concern about what the money would be used for, or is it that the money coming in is a reflection that this is truly there's some widespread support for it, and that's concerning, or is it both?
I think it's both. We definitely felt there was widespread support. I mean, I realized that the narrative, going back to the spring of 2021, the narrative was that people who felt a certain way were a small number of people, were et cetera, the fringe, so to speak. This was difficult for us to deal with in policing in Ontario, specifically because there was a large degree of support, and there were a number of instances. So it spoke to that support.
We needed to adjust the regulatory perimeter of FinTrack to include crowdfunding platforms and payment processors. So we did do that on a temporary basis under the authority of the Emergencies Act. And we applied it only to crowdfunding and payment processors who had information
right. And I understand
with these illicit activities. So then we made it longer term.
Before that protest and before the invocation of the Emergencies Act, there was no authority to do that, right? That's why you needed you're saying that's why you needed this. Is that fair?
The crowdfunding platforms and payment processors were not subject to review by FinTrack. Yes, that's accurate.
But even if they were not the crowdfunding, et cetera, if there was terrorist financing and there was money laundering, then you could apply FinTrack and the criminal code to crowdfunding, right? Without the Emergencies Act.
I can't answer that question because I'm not expert enough in FinTrack legislation.
were politicians and the media responsible for a certain amount of disinformation and misinformation with respect to these protests?
I was concerned by comments made publicly by public figures and in the media that I believed were not premised in fact. I would be just another person with a subjective perspective in this case, except for the fact that from my perspective, I was leading the criminal intelligence collection of information and the production of criminal intelligence in relation to these events. So I believed I was in a unique situation to understand what was transpiring. So when I read accounts that the state of Russia had something to do with it, or that this was a result of American influence, either financially or ideologically, or that Donald Trump was behind it, or that it was un-Canadian, or that the people participating were un-Canadian, and that they were not Canadian views and they were extremists, I found it to be problematic.
You say, by way of example, I see a marked increase in the conversation of extremists participating in these events and Canadians with extreme ideologies leading the charge. Although there are exceptions, I have not seen evidence of this. In fact, Hendon received and reported very little of this activity. It was not in evidence at the Ambassador Bridge, nor events related to the Blue Water Bridge. Further, the events in Toronto did not illustrate this. By way of example, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service had very little to report on and noted that their targets were not engaged. INSET, and sorry, can you just tell us what INSET is?
Yeah, INSET is a federal joint force operation led by the RCMP. It stands for Integrated National Security Enforcement Team, and they have the responsibility to engage investigations that meet the threshold of Section 83 of the Criminal Code.
Okay, and so INSET reported that the activity did not meet their threshold in national security. So I do not know where the political figures are acquiring information or intelligence on the extent of extremist involvement. So here, you're expressing the concern that this narrative around extremism is not consistent with the intelligence that you gathered, collected, reviewed over the course of the weeks leading up to these events.
That's correct.
There was at one point some arrests made in Coutts, Alberta, which you asked about.
Yes.
And that was also informing what was going on in Ottawa.
Yep. So to be fair on that, when the arrests occurred, we took multiple steps to acquire the information, specifically, as I discussed with the former counsel, to see what is the impact, what is the connection, et cetera. We got the information from the RCMP. I spoke with the Assistant Commissioner, I believe Assistant Commissioner or Deputy Commissioner Mark Flynn, and then with the person leading the investigation, and we determined that there was very little connection to Ottawa, and that therefore our assessment was there would be very little impact, and there was not.
I understand that you were the recent co-chair of the 2002 Leaders Summit for Action Chinese Canadians Together. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And as part of that summit, I understand you gave a video statement about how you became who you are today. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And it focused on a protest in Ottawa and becoming the lead plaintiff in the class action that you filed. Is that right?
Correct.
And there you described becoming the lead plaintiff in the class action as a fateful and surreal story. Is that right?
Correct.
And you said there you had the opportunity to make a difference, right?
Correct.
And you said that the lawyers needed a plaintiff.
Correct.
This is how you described the protest. It was insane. It was the strangest Twilight Zone purge scenario where people weren't quite purging, but the opportunity was there because there was just no laws being enforced. So it was this crazy, crazy thing with hot tubs, with right-wing extremists, and then right-wing moderates as well. And then your confused average grandmother saying, oh, isn't this really a great time? I wonder what the air raid sirens are for. Those are your statements, is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, and when you say purge scenario, for the folks at home as well as anybody here, I take it you're referring to the film series The Purge, right?
Yes, just in reference to the lack of laws that were in place.
Again, you said earlier, and you admitted that you stated it was the strangest Twilight Zone purge scenario where people weren't quite purging, but the opportunity was there, correct?
Yes.
Right, so you believe that the opportunity was there for a purge-type scenario, is that right?
I believe the opportunity was there, and it was an environment where these people who had been illegally occupying our streets felt that they had I don't know if this is the right word, they had the ability to do anything they wanted as they were not privy to the regulations that the rest of us members of society were. And I came to this conclusion through my witnessing of these crimes being committed, because really they were crimes. And even speaking with these individuals directly who had informed me that they were not going to face any consequences because they were protected.
I understand that you had the interactions with the protesters and you confronted them on Kent Street, is that correct?
Correct.
Right, and when you confronted those protesters, do you remember saying to them, which was recorded, go back to where the fuck you were from?
I may have said that.
Okay.
To our fellow Canadians, the time for political overreach is over. Our current government is Our current government is implementing rules and mandates that are destroying the foundation of our businesses, industries, and livelihoods. Canadians have been integral to the fabric of humanity in many ways that have shaped the planet. We are a peaceful country that has helped protect nations across the globe from tyrannical governments who oppress their people. Well, now it has happened to us. Taking our fight to the doorstep of the federal government and demanding that they cease all mandates against its people. Small businesses are being destroyed, homes are being destroyed, and people are being mistreated and denied fundamental necessities to survive. It's our duty as Canadians to put an end to this mandate. It is imperative that this happens because if we don't, our country will no longer be the country we have come to love. We are doing this for our future generations and to regain our lives back. We are asking for donations to help with the cost of fuel, food, and lodging to help ease the pressure of this arduous task. But it's a small price to pay for our freedoms. We thank you all for donations and know that you are helping reshape this once beautiful country back to the way it was.
No one, the RCMP was I think, quite clear and publicly clear that their intention here was not to take action on people who had made, in most cases, I think, relatively modest donations. So
Were you aware that the first time that the picture of the gentleman all covered in army fatigues with a mask over his face, walking with a Confederate flag through a crowd, it first appeared in an opinion piece in the Toronto Star from someone who actually works for the Liberal Party of Canada?
I'm aware of the articles, and I'm not aware of those facts that you mentioned.
Right. And have you identified the individual, one that it was all over the news, the gentleman that was carrying the Nazi flag? Have you identified him yet?
I would not be able to go into more specific details.
I take it then, sir, that you know that individual was...
I have not said anything of that respect to council. I have not testified to that, council.
In 6 years of working large demonstration events from the intelligence point of view, the writer, the bullet starting with in 6 years reads, in 6 years of working large demonstration events from the intelligence point of view, the writer has never seen such widespread community action. Did you understand the intelligence directorate to be saying that the level of mobilization and support for this protest across Canada was unprecedented?
So part of the context to this, in knowing the writer and knowing the people involved, is part of the challenge is the topic of mandates, the restrictions, vaccinations is an extremely divisive topic. I've seen it in my own family, and that you see that those challenges arise and it becomes a polarizing topic of discussion. So yes, it does have the potential to create language and debate amongst people who are normally cooperative.
In your witness statement, you noted that there was an issue with misinformation and disinformation and its impact on the policing of the Freedom Convoy. Could I just ask you to expand on that?
Yes, and there's a couple of really good examples. So the power of social media has evolved, and it continues to evolve. And when we look at when somebody sends out, we try to put out information from legitimate sources, and you try to make sure that they're verified. So we always refer people back to our website to look for true information. Misinformation comes when people are sending out unintentionally wrong information, and then it gets shared, and then you're trying to put that genie back in the bottle. And then the other issue was the disinformation, where people are knowingly putting out false information, and which is drawing on resources or creating a different narrative that you're trying to deal with. So, like for example, the wooden fence that's up protecting the construction site on Parliament Hill was being shared repeatedly over and over again, saying they're fortifying Parliament Hill in advance of the arrival of the convoys, and it was inflaming people. But you're trying to get the information out through your PLTs. It's there. It's construction. There's a big pit on the other side. We don't want people to get hurt, and that was a big challenge to try and stay ahead of.
Are you aware of an issue with protest organizers claiming that the police supported or backed the Freedom Convoy?
I know that there was messaging going out, and what happens is things start because they get taken out of context. So when one of the pillars of policing response to events that have the potential to be volatile, whether they're a regular call for service in 911 or going to a protest, is about de-escalating. You want to bring it, if people are running at a 9 or a 10 emotionally, you need to bring it down a level. So if that means being friendly with them and having a chat with them and taking a picture with them so that people are getting more relaxed and it doesn't turn into a confrontation, that's what traditionally we have encouraged our officers to do. But then what happens is it gets twisted and gets shared as I said, disinformation or misinformation.
And so if we just look at this document, the third email in the chain is an email from you, and under the fourth bullet that begins, it's difficult for everyone to differentiate fact from fiction.
There's my example, yes.
There's a reference to social media posts and receiving some direct messages from members of the public, and it continues there. So is the issue here that there was social media messaging online that the police were not only supporting the right to protest here, but were actually backing the protesters?
They have a right to protest. We are not supporting any cause. And part of it, if you go back to our operational plan, it tells them you can't wear symbols. We tell them they cannot overtly support or not support an event. They're there to be neutral.
But the issue here that you're identifying is that there's confusion that the police are in fact supporting the protesters.
Because they were allowing selfies to be taken with protesters, correct.
So would you characterize that as an instance of misinformation on social media?
Correct.
We see there's a comment by Drummond, Superintendent Drummond, do we still have room left on Wellington? And then we see that you say, I think there is, but we'll check cameras and assess. Do you remember making a statement that you thought there was still room on Wellington Street at this meeting?
Yeah, I remember there was numerous times where we were asked about what the status was, and I would have provided an update of wherever we had over the camera. So if I said there's notes in there that say that there was room, then there was room.
So we see this as a statement by you, gaps on Wellington, and then you list 4 intersections. Do you recognize this passage as you providing an update that you had checked and there was still space on Wellington to relocate vehicles to?
Yes.
True that the protest leaders were actually concerned about maintaining the safety lanes and raised that with you?
They did.
Right. And they wanted to ensure that the lanes were open so that emergency vehicles could always get through?
Correct.
Right. And the protest leaders cooperated with you and the city in maintaining those safety lanes, right?
Yes.
Starting with the Chateau Laurier, are you familiar with the concern that was raised?
Yes, it was raised directly to me and we had it investigated.
Can you explain to the commissioner what happened and what the city's follow-up was?
Certainly. Basically, there was an alarm for a water leak or a sprinkler head that had been knocked off, and so it was an alarm call for the fire service. The fire service responded with 4 different trucks from different directions, from different fire stations, which is normal from a deployment of our resources perspective. We don't respond with just one truck. We respond with multiple, especially for a high-risk setting like a hotel.
On arrival, one of the trucks, got close enough but didn't get very close, and that's what was observed by the hotel. And they thought, oh my God, if there's an emergency, they can't get in here. The reality is there was 3 other trucks responding. The responders were already in the hotel dealing with the incident. There was no delay in response. So, this was a time where people were very aware of all kinds of different issues, and it was being raised to us through the BIAs and Hotel Association that these types of concerns needed to be addressed because of public safety, their liability insurance, etc. So while I understand their fear, the risk of this call was very low, and we had pre-planned that facility daily, and we've had conversations with the manager since. So really, from a risk perspective, it was a relatively low risk event, but it did highlight that, if there was a fire, we may not get all 4 trucks there immediately, and there would be some need for movement of the protest vehicles. So while it was an incident that was looked at, it wasn't deemed as high risk as it was being first explained to us.
Before I begin, I have an issue that I need to address. As you know, and I've made applications several times, the disclosure in the record is entirely deficient. We've been trying to deal with these redactions. There's still redactions for parliamentary privilege, which the government has not removed. The rulings on the redactions are so important. And for example, Ms. Jody Thomas testified and said that she supported the invocation of the Emergencies Act. But there's a note that we got after we fought for the one redaction we got that said Jody Thomas did not. That would have been very helpful to have when she was on the stand under oath. This is happening constantly. I just want to put on the record that throughout this entire proceeding, all counsel here, and we're on national television, this is supposed to be completely transparent. This is the purpose of this. But it's just the fault that nobody's ordering DOJ to actually produce what they're obliged to do.